So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to do a little exercise that I have done previously with other attendees to our conferences around Australia. And it's important for us that obviously when we're talking about setting values as an apartment community, some of you would have actually done that in a commercial setting where within your business you would have sat around a table and talked about values. And I think the important thing about values is that obviously when you actually have got an agreed set of values, it can really make a difference in terms of guiding your decision making, in terms of the upkeep of your building, how you maintain your community, and the ways that you can actually then harness, greater community spirit. So I was actually asking you this question before we actually had Angus Aberdeen join us. And from your perspective, I'm happy for you to put your hands up and we can have a chat about this. What is troubling strata? So has anyone from the audience got anything that they would like to say at this point? No? It looks like everybody's happy. That would be great if everybody is happy. From our perspective, obviously, we do research. And while we know that people, about 65% of people actually are enjoying their lifestyle, it's convenient for their needs, it's secure, there's lock up and leave lifestyle. What we're also seeing is that these are the issues that are kind of like dampening the spirit for apartment living, and certainly the cost of ongoing maintenance and management, difficult owners, conflict with neighbours and the committee or with the strata council, procrastinating committees or strata councils, defects and the lack of accountability by developers, builders and government, or poor ongoing support and maintenance. So if you have experienced any of those, and I certainly have experienced that within my apartment community, then obviously, these are the things that, thank you, Elizabeth, for that comment. Certainly, we're concerned about the fact that these situations, in terms of lack of action, which is primarily what we are seeing here, is what's causing a lot of people to actually think twice about obviously living in an apartment. And as Elizabeth just said, it's a lack of accountability. But of course, in New South Wales, if you're a part of a committee and you actually have a legal responsibility to actually maintain your building and do repairs and that kind of thing. And so it's very important that you do remember that, because if you don't, then obviously you're going to have to be held to account at some point. So from our perspective, when we talk about setting values, it's principles or standards of behaviour, one's judgment of what is important in life. And so you may actually have a number of values personally. You may believe that you're honest, that you're dependable, that you're kind. If these are your values, they will drive your actions. Anything that actually then goes against your values often is uncomfortable. It makes you feel, that something's not quite right. And from the Australian Apartment Advocacy, we have a number of values. So we're about empowerment of our owners within the apartments to actually make good decisions, enjoy their apartment lifestyle. We're tenacious. We're very much focused on making sure that consumer protection measures come into play, that we actually, once we start on some advocacy work, we don't give up. We're passionate, and it's important to be passionate because, of course, we're talking about people's livelihoods, like Angus said, and also then, their feeling safe and secure and having a home that operates the way it should. We're about best practice, and certainly we don't accept shoddy outcomes or shoddy behaviour. We're trailblazers. We do a lot of things that nobody else is doing in the apartment space. And more recently, because of what happened with the Strata Trap story, there's transparency. And I think that's really important because we have seen some behaviour within the apartment sector which has been far from transparent And unfortunately, the only ones that suffer typically are the apartment owners. So what we're going to do now is actually kind of like do a bit of a brainstorm. What I do need is audience participation for this. So what I'm going to ask for you to do is basically talk to me about what are some of the values that you could have within your apartment community. Does anyone want to kind of like put their hand up or put a comment in their chat? All right, so we've got a couple of comments here. We'll have to let that question go. Okay, so Chuck has said accountability. That's correct. You do want to have accountability within your apartment building. What other values could you have? Transparency. Chuck's on fire this morning. Has anybody else had their coffee? What else could we have? Respect. Thank you, Peter. Respect is very important. Being fair-minded, considering that we're working for collective benefit. Beautiful. A real sense of community. That is correct. You know, at the end of the day, if you show respect to others within your building, it's very hard for them to actually continually be negative to you. Okay, so Elizabeth, I see that you're having some issues with no transparency. So definitely transparency is one of the things that we would be focused on. Thank you, Michelle. Integrity, empathy, and accountability. And empathy was certainly something that Angus talked about as well earlier on. So these are the kinds of things. So what I would like you to think about doing within your own within your own OC and with your committee is actually gathering together a group of people. It may be for a social event, it may be for a barbecue or a sundowner, and having a whiteboard and talking to your lot owners about the fact that you want to set group values. Now, ideally, this would be a fantastic thing to do at the very first AGM, where typically you would have a greater proportion of people turning up. But at the same time, it can be a social event. So definitely think about doing this. So what I would suggest you do is that you seat everybody in a theatre row scenario, and you have your whiteboard and you ask people to brainstorm the kinds of values that you would like to see in your building. So as we talked before, we might actually hear people say, you know, we want to be generous, we want to be inclusive, we want to be tolerant. We want to be transparent, which is what some of the others have actually come up with. We want to be decisive. We want to be proud of our building. We want to make sure that communication is a priority, that there's trust, that we're united, that there's camaraderie amongst ourselves. So these are all the things that you might actually brainstorm onto a whiteboard, okay? And the more variety of words, the better. And sometimes you will get duplication, but I think it's a really important thing to do, because what you're actually doing is getting buy-in from your OC and from the owners to actually be part of this. So it is very important that when you're doing this kind of brainstorming, that you actually do make sure that everybody has a chance to actually be involved. Everybody has a chance that they can be heard, because when you actually have that, then what will actually happen is that people will obviously be appreciative of being heard. Now, once you've got a whole range of words up on your screen, what I suggest you do then is actually get people to come up and actually mark their preferred choices. So ultimately what you want to have is between 5 to 7 values. So everybody can come up and then vote. So you can either do it with a blackboard marker. Everybody gets a blackboard marker. If you've got 40 people in the room, that can be done quite quickly. If you've got 100 people in the room, that might take a bit more time. So ultimately what you might do is very similar to a ballot when you actually elect your committee. And people write down the 5 or 7 words that they actually believe are values that they want to see in the building. And ultimately, those words that get the most votes then are the words that become, your values. And at that point, it is advisable that what you would do is then talk about, how do we actually define that? How do we as a committee, or how do we as a group of owners define it? So if we were going to say that we're tolerant, what does that mean to us as an apartment community? So, you may have to brainstorm. That may take some time. You may have to kind of like write some words, wipe them out, rewrite some words. But, for example, tolerant, we accept people's differences, whether that is cultural, education, background, etc., as we understand that diversity as the vibrancy of our apartment community. Our community is a safe place. So what happens is that once you've got that word, you actually then make it into a sentence. And then what you actually ask your members who are involved in this process, you ask them, what does tolerant look like in our community? And you give examples. So listening respectfully to people's requests, not commenting on people's dress, accents, food, way of life in a derogatory manner. So what you do is, once you've actually defined what that looks like, in terms of then the sentence, you then talk about action-wise what that looks like within your community. So I'm going to kind of like hand across back to you guys, and I'm going to ask you to actually maybe look at one kind of value that you've nominated, and then maybe play around with what that might look like. So I'm more than happy if you want to put your hand up and talk to us what you're thinking about with your sentence, or if you would like to write it into the chat. But I certainly would appreciate some feedback that you might have. And I know that one of the comments that we've just had in the chat is that, I'm talking about kind of like unicorns and fairy floss with this. But at the end of the day, why is a community not harmonious? It's not harmonious because it's not listening, it's not communicating, it's not actually showing empathy, it's not cohesive. So if you really do want to get past that and actually then provide some kind of like guidelines or some leadership in this space, that's why it's really important to actually talk about the values, and why it's more important to have as many people in your community involved as possible. Because if you are sitting at your committee table and about to make a decision, any one of those committee members can say, does that align with our values? And if it doesn't, it's a very quick litmus test, isn't it? In terms of then, yes, this is what I want to actually make sure that we're, actioning or demonstrating in our leadership. And certainly I understand that there's a lot of people in this session who've got some issues with their current OC and also with their current strata manager. But everybody can complain about things, but the fact is, are you part of the solution? And I think that's really important. So Michelle has got something here. Thank you, Michelle. One of your values could be responsible, which in this instance, Michelle's saying understanding of the strata law and ensuring compliance in the most streamlined and effectual way. Now, I think that's really important. You've talked about streamline and effectual, and I think that, at the end of the day, you've got to really be quite clear and concise in the description that you actually put around these values, so that everybody who actually sees them understands them. So thank you, Michelle, for making that contribution. I appreciate that. So basically, once you've actually then created your 5 or 6 values with your sentences, and also then with how that looks in terms of action, it's very important that you share it. Obviously, doing it as a once-off exercise is not going to actually ensure longevity within your building. So you need to promote it, and ways to promote it are through your Facebook or WhatsApp chat groups. So you can certainly, reinforce the values, but at the same time, if you see someone in your building reflecting those values, so if you see someone helping one of your elderly residents with their shopping up to their apartment building, and one of your values is, community or inclusion, it's very nice to say, I saw Mrs. Smith today helping, our neighbour with her shopping, and we just thought that was a beautiful example of those values that we're talking about. So congratulations. Now, you heard me talking before about it's easier to attract bees with honey than with vinegar, and that's definitely the case. So if you actually are promoting and reinforcing that positive behaviour within your building, very similar to a workplace, very similar to even to a classroom, what you'll find is that people will actually start to reflect that more and more. If you focus on the negative and you're reinforcing the negative and you're always talking about how bad things are, ultimately nothing is going to change. You have to change your outlook, you have to change your language, you have to reframe. And by reframing, then you're able to actually create that cohesive, harmonious community that you want. I remember actually being in a school setting, and I was working with 100 teachers, and they were complaining about their principal and the fact that their principal wasn't doing the right thing. And I said to them, there's 100 of you in this room. And if each one of you actually then did one thing a day which aligned with your school values or your school kind of like rules, you don't need the principal. Because there's 100 of you basically doing the right thing every day, and that in its own sense will create a wave of change. So if you're relying on the committee to always do the right thing and they're not, don't complain about it. Get it on the committee, and this is one way for you to actually press a reset button and talk about your values as a community. So make sure you promote it, put it on your lists and community notice boards. The more often people see it and read it, it's a bit like a dripping tap, the more likely they are to actually observe it and implement it. Use it when you're doing the decision making at a committee level. There's nothing wrong for you to actually say in your minutes from the committee meetings, this decision was guided by these values, and this is why we're doing what we're doing. And at the end of the day, that will actually make people feel like they're actually having input, and at the same time that they also, are also being, what they have actually selected as their values are being applied in certainly everyday life. And Peter here has put one of his comments is respectful, being respectful that we all have to share living close to each other as a harmonious community. Being considerate of our actions and how they affect others is important in maintaining that harmony. Perfect, Peter. 10 out of 10. And that's exactly right. At the end of the day, as a committee, you have to show a leadership situation, a leadership role, and at the same time, if you're actually demonstrating that, and that's the most important thing, is to demonstrate those values in action. We all know those people who walk the walk but don't, talk the talk but don't walk the walk. It's very important that you do. Speak about it at the AGM. Make sure that the first agenda, once you actually have a quorum and you've selected the chairperson, is to revisit those values. Ask anybody in the meeting to share good news stories that align with those values. Once you set those values, it's an opportunity to rejoice. It's an opportunity to share what you have in common, because obviously living in an apartment, there is a huge diversity, but that's the same as if you're in a workplace. And so, we are recommending that you actually think to yourself, if I've got a conflict, how do we resolve this? Not just for now, but if it's going to be an ongoing issue, how do we get ahead of it? Prevention better than cure, right? How do we actually make sure that we can minimize these kinds of negative situations in our apartment complex? So I hope that's the first time I've done that exercise online. Usually it's done in a room with a whole bunch of people kind of like shouting words at me. But I hope that you have found that useful. And I hope that maybe you might take that little snippet away with you and actually maybe apply it because at the end of the day, you can change the dialogue, you can change the actions, and you can change the kind of sense of community that you have in your building by very simply showing leadership.